Hi, I am Dr. Sakib, and this is my channel Learning Anatomy. And as you know, that we have been discussing the cerebellum anatomy, and today I will discuss in the fourth lecture the functions of the cerebellum. Latin word gives origin to the cerebellum, which means little brain. It has three important primary functions. Number one, maintenance of posture and balance. And number two, maintenance of muscle tone. And number three, coordination of voluntary motor activity. Here are various parts of the cerebellum in the schematic diagram. Here you see this is, the superior surface of the cerebellum, and this is the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Here you see there are some fissures, and here it is a primary fissure on the anterior surface. This is a horizontal fissure, and this is part in front is the anterior lobe in front of the primary fissure, and between the primary fissure and the horizontal fissure there is the middle lobe or the posterior lobe, which is the largest lobe. And the third one is a flocculonodular lobe. This is a flocculus and this is a nodule. This I have described in detail in my previous videos on cerebellum here on YouTube on my channel Learning Anatomy. So first function is the maintenance of posture and balance. So let's study in a little bit detail. The flocculonodular lobe, also known as the vestibulocerebellum or the archicerebellum, is the lobe involved here. Posture, balance, and equilibrium and eye movements allows cerebellum to coordinate eye movements with head movements and position to keep images focused on retina. This function is maintained by flocculonodular lobe, and it is involved in motor learning and skilled planned motor activity. It does not initiate motor activity. This is very important for the cerebellum, that it does not initiate motor activity. Instead, it controls or influences the strength, timing, and accuracy of ongoing motor activity. And the second function is the muscle tone involved. Here is the cerebellum. Its anterior lobe is involved here, which is also known as the spinocerebellum or the paleocerebellum. It's the lobe involved here. Yes, muscle tone, timing, and accuracy of ongoing movements, particularly in the trunk and limb girdles. Reciprocal connections with the spinal cord allows the cerebellum to influence descending spinal cord control mechanisms. Number three, coordination of voluntary motor activity. Middle or posterior lobe, which is also known as neocerebellum or pontocerebellum, is the lobe involved here. Skilled learned movements, hand-eye coordination with appropriate strength, timing, and precision. Cerebellum to red nucleus allows influence over all descending cortical fibers to influence volitional movements. So functional areas of the cerebellar cortex. Cerebellar cortex may be divided into three functional areas. Here you have a look at that. This is one, here is lying the vermis of the cerebellum, and this is the vermal area. And here you see the representation, the cortex of the vermis influences the movements of the long axis of the body. Here is the long axis of the body. Yes, here it is involved. This is schematic representation, which is an unfolded schematic of cerebellum demonstrating body map areas, right? So influences the movements of long axis of the body, neck, shoulders, thorax, abdomen, and hips. You could see over here all these areas. Area lying immediately lateral to the vermis is called intermediate zone. Here, this is the intermediate zone, the paravermis of the cerebellar hemisphere. It controls the muscles of the distal parts of the limbs, especially hands and feet. Here you see hands and feet. The lateral zone here, this is the lateral zone, the cerebellar cortex, and this is associated with the planning of sequential movements of the whole body and is involved with the conscious assessment of errors in movement. The functions of the cerebellum continue. Cerebellum receives afferents regarding voluntary movement from cerebral cortex and from muscles, tendons, and joints. It receives information regarding balance from vestibular nerve and information regarding sight via the tactocerebellar tract. All this information reaches cerebellar cortical circuitry by mossy fibers and climbing fibers and is transmitted to Purkinje cells. And all these cells are mentioned and very well explained by me in my lecture on circuitry of cerebellum. That is, I think, third lecture, second lecture. Axons of the Purkinje cells project mostly on deep cerebellar nuclei. So, output of the vermis projects to the vestigial nucleus. You know the anatomy of the cerebellum, 4 nuclei, and one is the vestigial nucleus. Output of the vermis, of course, projects to vestigial nucleus. Of course, this is the medial most nucleus. Intermediate regions of the cortex project to interposed nucleus. These are the 2 nuclei together, interposed nucleus, globose and emboliform. And the lateral most nucleus dentate, that the output of lateral part of the cerebellar hemisphere projects to that dentate nucleus. Some of the Purkinje cell axons directly exit the cerebellum and terminate on the lateral vestibular nucleus. Purkinje axons have an inhibitory influence on the neurons of the cerebellar nuclei and lateral vestibular nuclei. These all phenomena have been explained with the help of diagrams, previous lectures here on YouTube, learning anatomy. So the cerebellar output reaches sites of origin of the descending pathways that influence motor activity at the spinal segments. So the cerebellum has no direct neuronal connections with the lower motor neurons, but implies its influence indirectly through the cerebral cortex and brainstem. So it's a very important line. It has no direct neuronal connection. The cerebellum has no direct neuronal connection with the lower motor neurons. Its influence is exerted by the cerebral cortex and the brainstem. I will talk about the movement, which is a very tricky topic, the movement, and I seek the opportunity to involve all the things over here, the structures. The cerebral cortex is involved in movement, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia as well. They function in association with each other to control motor activities. Movement is controlled by cerebral cortex, cerebellum and basal ganglia as they act in unison, in synchronization. So the cerebellum plays major roles in the timing of motor activities and in a rapid, smooth progression from one muscle movement to the next. It also helps control the intensity of muscle contraction when the muscle load changes and controls the necessary instantaneous interplay between agonist and antagonist muscle groups. So what's the role of the basal ganglia? So that's now you know what I'm discussing, the movement as it relates to cerebellum as well. So along with the basal ganglia, and the third thing here is the cerebral cortex. The ultimate control lies here. So basal ganglia help plan and control complex patterns of muscle movement. They control a relative intensity of the separate movements, directions of movements, and sequencing of multiple successive and parallel movements to achieve specific complicated motor goals. It helps sequence some motor activities and also monitors and makes corrective adjustments in the body's motor activities while they are being executed so that they will conform to the motor signals directed by the cerebral motor cortex and other parts of the brain. The cerebellum then compares, right? So basically, this is a comparator. I will tell you from a picture. So barely needed here, I think now. The cerebellum then compares the actual movements as depicted by the peripheral sensory feedback information with the movements intended by the motor system. The cerebellum also aids the cerebral cortex in planning the next sequential movement a fraction of a second in advance while the current movement is still being executed, thus helping the person to progress smoothly from one movement to the next. So that I wanted to say that cerebellum acts as a comparator, right? I will explain from this picture. This is the cerebellum, this is the comparator, right? How it is? Let's read it out. Cerebellum is a coordinator of precise movements by continually comparing the output of the motor area of the cerebral cortex with the proprioceptive input from the site of the muscle action. In this way, it produces the required adjustment by influencing activity of the lower motor neurons. The cerebellum sends feedback to the cerebral motor cortex to inhibit the agonist muscles and stimulate the antagonist muscles. This feedback from the cerebellum, it inhibits the agonist muscles and stimulates the antagonist muscles. In this way, extent of the voluntary movement is limited. Here you see very important picture. This is the cerebellum and acting as a comparator. What it is that? It is the cerebral cortex, and this is the command center. This is comparator cerebellum, and this is a muscle, right? This is a where the function is to produce its contraction to bring movement, for example, right? So from here you see the command center. It is receiving the information from eye, right? Visual. This is here it is, and the ear, auditory information. Here it is over here relate, and then it cerebral cortex sends signal to the muscle for contraction. Here it is contracted. Then the feedback, here it is going feedback from the muscle directly to the cerebral cortex. And now let's see what is cerebellum is doing, which is the comparator for the movement. The cerebral cortex sending information to the cerebellum, which sends information to the muscle, right? And this information basically is this feedback taken to the cerebellum back from the muscle, and then comparator, this is transmitting to the cerebral cortex. And the function is basically what the cerebellum does, that it stimulates the antagonist muscles and it inhibits the agonist muscles to make the movement very smooth and controlled. I will explain it still further. Function of the cerebellum to prevent overshoot and to damp movements, right? This was mentioning that if the cerebellum as a comparator does not control this movement by this agonist and antagonist action, so it will be the muscle would be overshooting, and thus it damps this movements, this cerebellum, right? This is a simple mechanism. Almost all movements of the body are pendular, right? So for instance, when an arm is moved, momentum develops and the momentum must be overcome before the movement can be stopped. Because of momentum, all pendular movements have a tendency to overshoot. If overshooting occurs in a person whose cerebellum has been destroyed, the conscious centers of the cerebrum eventually recognize this occurrence and initiate a movement in the reverse direction to attempt to bring the arm to its intended position. However, the arm, by virtue of its momentum, overshoots once more in the opposite direction, and appropriate corrective signals must again be instituted. Thus, the arm oscillates back and forth past its intended point for several cycles before it finally fixes on its mark. This effect is called an action tremor or intention tremor, right? So this is the mechanism behind the pathology, where of the intention tremor or the action tremor, which is characteristic of a lesion of the cerebellum. It has to be differentiated from the Parkinsonism tremor, which is a pill rolling tremor. There I will try to upload a video very soon discussing the diseases and the clinicals of the cerebellum. So movement continues if the cerebellum is intact. In the appropriate learned subconscious signals stop the movement precisely at the intended point, thereby preventing the overshoot and the tremor. This activity is the basic characteristic of a damping system. All control systems regulating pendular elements that have inertia must have damping circuits built into the mechanisms. For motor control by the nervous system, the cerebellum provides most of this damping function, right? This damping function, I've already told it to you that this is a comparator, the cerebellum. So another interesting heading, the timing function for sequential movements. And this is its explanation. Another important function of the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemisphere is to provide appropriate timing for each succeeding movement. In the absence of these cerebellar zones, one loses the subconscious ability to predict how far the different parts of the body will move in a given time. Without this timing capability, the person becomes unable to determine when the next sequential movement needs to begin. As a result, the succeeding movement may begin too early or more likely too late, right? So this is the explanation of the previously discussed this timing function of the sequential movements. Then the extra motor predictive functions of the cerebellum. The cerebellum, the large lateral lobes, also help to time events other than movements of the body. For instance, the rates of progression of both auditory and visual phenomena can be predicted by the brain, but both of these require cerebellar participation. As an example, a person can predict from the changing visual scene how rapidly he or she is approaching an object. A striking experiment that demonstrates the importance of the cerebellum in this ability is the effects of removing the large lateral portion of the cerebellum in monkeys. Such a monkey occasionally charges into the wall of a corridor because it is unable to predict when it will reach the wall. So isn't it strange? Yes, it is quite possible that the cerebellum provides a time base, perhaps using time delay circuits against which signals from other parts of the central nervous system can be compared. It is often stated that the cerebellum is particularly helpful in interpreting rapidly changing spatio-temporal relations in sensory information. So, function of the basal ganglia in executing patterns of motor activity, the Putamen circuit. Which we'll discuss the Putamen circuit. One of the principal roles of the basal ganglia in motor control is to function in association with the corticospinal system to control complex pattern of motor activity. An example is the writing of letters of the alphabet. When the basal ganglia sustain serious damage, the cortical system of motor control can no longer provide these patterns. Instead, one's writing becomes crude, as if one were learning how to write for the first time. Other patterns that require the basal ganglia are cutting paper with scissors, hammering nails, shooting a basketball through a hoop, passing a football, throwing a baseball, the movements of the shoveling dirt, most aspects of the vocalization, control movements of the eyes, and virtually any other of our skilled movements, most of them performed subconsciously. The cerebellum role in learning. So this is very important. That's cerebellum has a very important role in learning. As motor skills are being learned, climbing fiber activation produces a huge complex spike in the Purkinje cell, and this in turn produces a long-term modification of the pattern of mossy fiber input to that particular Purkinje cell. And this circuitry of the cerebellum, the whole circuit, is explained by me in my second lecture on cerebellum. So you must read that. If you are not gone through that, you must listen, watch that video to understand this mossy fiber and climbing fiber mechanism. And there I have discussed the glomerulus as well, and all the cells which is found in the cerebellum, the basket cells, and the ganglionic cells, all the three layers, the Purkinje cells. And this is especially so when there is mismatch between an intended movement and the movement that is actually executed. Climbing fiber activity acts as an error signal and may cause synchronously activated parallel fiber inputs to the weakened. Climbing fibers thus provide a teaching signal that induces synaptic modification in parallel fiber Purkinje cell synapses. This is the basis of importance of net practice prior to playing cricket matches at an international level, for example. So thank you very much for listening to this, though very interesting, but it was regarded as a rather concept forming at a difficult lecture. So this is the thing, and I request you to encourage me by subscribing my channel and viewing and sharing it. So I will be posting next video very soon, inshallah. There was a delay in posting this video as I was busy hectically in my academic calendar, the college. So thank you very much. Goodbye.